In the last video, we opened 10 PS3 games from GameSpot. It was not bad. Failure. And now we're going to take a closer look. Eventually, each of these games will get their own retrospectives, but before I dive deep, I want to dive shallow and give each one a few minutes in the spotlight. So, with these 10 new old used games come 10 hopefully interesting stories. Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, developed collaboratively by 38 studios and Big Huge Games and published by Electronic Arts, battled its way to the PlayStation 3 on February 7, 2012. In this surprisingly big open-world action RPG, you play as the Fateless One, the resurrected protagonist unbound from the threads of destiny that govern the fates of all the other inhabitants of the Amalur universe. The gameplay successfully blends the exploration and questing typical of Western RPGs with a fast and fluid combat system inspired by games like God of War, allowing players to seamlessly weave between magic, ranged attacks, and melee strikes using weapons like Feyblades and daggers, swords, hammers, various sticks of magic, and the badass chakram. Character progression is driven by a dynamic destiny system that permits players to organically shift their class based on how they allocate skill points across archetypal skill trees, with the ability to change their build mid-game. The project was originally conceived by Big Huge Games before being acquired by 38 Studios, founded by retired Major League Baseball pitcher and avid gamer Curt Schilling.
Yeah, but I had the perfect gaming life. I made a stupid amount of money, and I worked once every 5 days. So I had a lot of free time.
Schilling's rather hubristic ambition was to create a massive multiplayer online role-playing game. This was to be a World of Warcraft killer and make Schilling Bill Gates rich. In the midst of the MMORPG's development cycle, they needed some cash flow. Serendipitously, THQ was about to shut down Big Huge Games at the tail end of a single-player action RPG project they were working on. So, 38 Studios bought Big Huge Games, and Reckoning was born as a prequel designed to introduce the high fantasy universe to consumers. The broader context of the game's development and release is almost entirely dominated by one of the most infamous financial implosions in modern software history. We'll dive into this in the next full retrospective, but more so to clear up some common misconceptions. Developed primarily by United Front Games in collaboration with San Diego studio, ModNation Racers drifted its way onto the PlayStation 3 on May 25, 2010. This highly customizable kart racing game operated on Sony's Play Create Share paradigm, offering a suite of user-generated content tools. The core gameplay loop requires players to master drifting mechanics to fill a multi-tiered meter, which could be expended to gain speed boosts, shields, or slam into the competition. Beyond the immediate arcade racing and upgrading, the game provides an incredibly deep creation station accessed via the ModSpot central hub. Here, players could create complex racetracks in minutes, modify the performance and aesthetics of their karts, and design personalized avatars with an extensive array of assets. Internally, early in development, the project was referred to under the generic moniker Sony Kart, reflecting the corporate mandate to simply provide the PlayStation 3 with an exclusive mascot racer a la Mario Kart. However, the developers pivoted the aesthetic direction by heavily grounding the game's visual language in vinyl toy culture and urban pop art. To anchor the single-player experience and provide context for this creativity, the studio implemented a surprisingly engaging narrative campaign following a prodigy racer named Tag. Tag has to navigate a cutthroat racing championship while battling the nefarious Uncle Richard, a corporate antagonist intent on stifling unique style by forcing racers to use generic vehicles produced by the generically named Conservative Motors. There are some really interesting stories behind the creatives who worked on this game, so stay tuned for the retrospective. Battlefield Hardline, developed by Visceral Games and published by Electronic Arts, was dramatically released for the PlayStation 3 in North America on March 17, 2015. In a radical and highly publicized departure from the traditional and well-defined franchise, Hardline pivoted to focus on urban crime, heists, and domestic police operations in sunny Miami. The gameplay shifted its emphasis toward asymmetrical, objective-based multiplayer modes, utilizing the Frostbite 3 engine to deliver some sweet destructibility within civilian environments, rather than the usual battlefield arenas. In the single-player campaign, players assume the role of Miami Police Department detective Nick Mendoza, navigating a criminal underworld through a gameplay loop that heavily, and not a little surprisingly, incentivizes stealth, flashing a police badge for non-lethal takedowns, and evidence collection over the shoot-first, never-ask-questions format typical of the genre. The development and marketing of the game were characterized by a desire to emulate the narrative pacing and structure of prestige television dramas in an attempt to elevate the standard shooter campaign. Seeking to distance this entry from its immediate predecessors, the narrative team at Visceral Games purposely divided the campaign into 10 discrete episodes, complete with cliffhanger endings, coming up on Hardline teasers,
next time on Hardline. The hell were you thinking anyway?
And previously on Hardline recaps.
Previously on Hardline.
That's Neil Ray. Says he has information regarding the drug war that's plaguing Miami.
The studio drew inspiration from the sharp dialogue of legendary crime author Elmore Leonard, whose work also inspired the brilliant TV show Justified, explicitly shooting for a people-over-plot philosophy. Visceral Games also added a subtle homage to their own corporate history within the world. Players can discover criminal NPCs playing and commenting on the studio's magnum opus, Dead Space.
Oh, wow, the line gun is fantastic.
Along with an Easter egg of the advanced suit helmet hidden within the multiplayer maps, displaying the studio's desire to retain their unique identity while operating within a massive EA franchise. I must admit, before doing this preliminary research on Hardline, I had just about zero desire to play a Battlefield game. Not because I hate the franchise or anything, but I got epically burnt out on those early first-person shooters. Except Redneck Rampage. I fucking love that game. At time of writing, Hardline will be pulled from digital storefronts in a few weeks. So, if you want to purchase it digitally, it's probably too late. Sorry. Developed by Insomniac Games as their highly anticipated first multi-platform title, and published via the EA Partners program, Fuse shot their shot and somehow made it to market on May 28, 2013. The game operates as a 4-player cooperative third-person shooter focused on a squad of deeply flawed but heavily armed mercenaries called Overstrike 9, who are tasked with retrieving a highly volatile, world-ending alien energy source. The mechanical hook supporting archetypical combat roles comes in the form of proprietary xenotech weaponry, with each character wielding a distinct tool, like a mag shield for absorbing damage and tanking, an arc shot for sniping, or a shattergun for crowd control. Solo players are given the ability to use the Leap feature, which allows them to possess any AI-controlled teammate on the fly without breaking the flow of combat. Despite the fluid cover mechanics and a unified progression system, which linked your character's growth between the main campaign and the Echelon survival mode, the game wasn't able to maintain much long-term player engagement due to repetitive environmental design and some notably bad AI. The developmental history of the game was profoundly troubled and is widely cited by industry historians as a cautionary tale of leaning too heavily on the destructive and homogenizing influence of market-driven focus testing. Originally announced in 2011 to immense critical excitement under the title Overstrike, the game was initially presented as a highly stylized, comedic, and cartoonish espionage adventure. However, about halfway through the dev cycle, the studio profoundly altered the tone, stripping away the Pixar-esque aesthetics to be replaced by more gritty and photorealistic visuals, unfortunately leading to a more generic militaristic identity. This drastic pivot was reportedly influenced by external focus groups, often described by frustrated devs as young 12-year-olds desperate to feel mature, who complained that the original art style looked too juvenile, demanding the grim realism popularized by dominant franchises like Call of Duty and Battlefield. Thus, the leadership pivoted, turning what would have been a fun and whimsical spy caper into a generic shooter with a paper-thin narrative simply to satisfy the volatile whims of a focus group. The result was alienating the studio's loyal core fan base while also failing to capture the hardcore military shooter audience, ultimately resulting in a commercial and critical failure that completely buried the new intellectual property. Developed by the Brighton-based Black Rock Studio and published by Disney Interactive Studios, Split Second exploded onto the PlayStation 3 on May 18, 2010. The game redefined the arcade combat racing genre by brilliantly discarding traditional vehicular weaponry in favor of weaponizing the physical track itself, framing the gameplay within the context of a hyper-competitive reality TV show. Players continuously fill a power play meter with fast and furious driving maneuvers. Once filled, this meter can be strategically expended to trigger fully awesome cinematic environmental hazards, like helicopters dropping exploding thingies directly on the track, to collapsing airport control towers and detonating entire city blocks, which not only obliterate leading opponents but can also alter the structural layout of the track. This reliance on timing and situational awareness created an unexpectedly strategic racing game, demanding that players anticipate sudden environmental shifts rather than just memorizing the most ideal racing lines. Prior to being entirely absorbed by the Disney Interactive corporate umbrella in 2006, Black Rock Studio had established a reputation for developing serious simulation racers like MotoGP and Pure. When the initial ideation for their next project began under the working title Driving Storm, the core mechanic of environmental destruction was actually themed around surviving severe but uncontrollable natural disasters. However, upon Disney's direct involvement, the concept was retooled to fit a more marketable blockbuster entertainment format, before finalizing the reality TV show framing and the name Split Second. Releasing in the same commercial window as bizarre creations equally ambitious Blur, the title was positioned to directly challenge the historical dominance of Criterion Games' Burnout franchise by offering destruction on the scale of big-budget Hollywood action films, though it sadly failed to generate the sustained sales needed to keep the studio afloat. Developed by the acclaimed Swedish team at Starbreeze Studios and published by 2K Games, The Darkness was summoned onto the PlayStation 3 in North America on June 25, 2007. Based heavily on the popular Top Cow Productions comic book series of the same name, the game is a narrative-driven first-person shooter that blends a gritty but grounded mobster drama with supernatural horror and a character inevitably named Uncle Paulie.
Hey, it's your Uncle Paulie.
Players control Jackie Estacado, a mafia hitman who, upon the evening of his 21st birthday, becomes the unwilling host for a parasitic demonic entity known simply as the Darkness.
Happy birthday, Ratface. You're finally legal.
The gameplay requires players to strategically manage environmental lighting to survive. Shooting out street lamps and hiding in deep shadows actively empowers Jackie to summon darkling minions.
Every man for himself!
And utilize massive demon snake arms to brutally impale enemies or yeet heavy objects across the room. This complex quad-wielding combat system, forcing players to manage conventional guns alongside some sweet supernatural abilities, creates a uniquely empowering tactical loop. The path to retail for the title was fraught with severe financial instability that nearly derailed the entire project before it could be realized. The publishing rights were originally acquired by Majesco Entertainment in early 2005, but as that publisher faced severe economic distress and collapsing stock prices, the rights were abruptly sold off in December of that year, leaving the game's fate highly uncertain. Fortunately, 2K Games acquired the publishing rights in March 2006, providing Starbreeze the financial runway needed to realize their ambitious vision. To help build a grounded sense of immersion, Starbreeze famously rendered full feature-length vintage films like To Kill a Mockingbird and The Street Fighter with Sonny Chiba, as well as old TV shows, cartoons, and music videos that players could sit and watch in real time with Jackie's girlfriend on an in-game couch.
Let's just sit here for a while. Okay?
The game released to very positive reviews and maintains a passionate and devoted fan base.
Sweden, most likely. And everybody knows that the Swedes are open-minded when it comes to sex. For our species sex, too, I'm sure.
Developed by the RPG veterans at Obsidian Entertainment and published by Sega, Alpha Protocol snuck onto the PlayStation 3 on June 1st, 2010. Marketed as an espionage role-playing game, the game puts players in the tactical boots of Michael Thornton, a newly recruited agent for a clandestine United States government organization who quickly goes rogue to unravel an international conspiracy. The gameplay is viewed from a third-person perspective and allows for some deep customization. Arguably the most remarkable aspect of the game's design, however, is its highly reactive dialogue stance system. Players are under a time limit and must quickly choose responses based on distinct attitudes which permanently alter NPC dispositions, story branches, and available mission parameters. The incredibly ambitious scope of the project was almost its undoing, resulting in a notoriously troubled production cycle that birthed a brilliant but technically flawed final product. Sega initially approached Obsidian in 2006 to conceptualize a brand new intellectual property, but the project languished in developmental purgatory for 2 years without a dedicated project director or lead designer to steer the ship. Developers drew heavy inspiration from espionage icons such as Jason Bourne, James Bond, and Michael Weston from the brilliant Burn Notice. The developers struggled to balance some of the complex RPG dice roll mechanics with the immediate feedback required for third-person shooter controls. In other words, real-time combat was governed by stats. Cool in theory, often frustrating in practice. The production overall was so turbulent and fractured that Sega often dispatched internal QA and cohesion strike teams to help plug the plot holes and streamline unwieldy narrative branches. Despite severe polish issues, the game's underlying logic was entirely unprecedented. It's one of the few RPGs where a player can actively choose to alienate, or even execute, every NPC they meet, and the game will completely adapt, offering unique functional narrative paths rather than punishing the player with arbitrary fail states. Viewed by some as a frustrating and unplayable mess, and others as a frustrating and flawed masterpiece, I have zero doubt this unique cult classic will make for a fascinating retrospective. Developed by Starbreeze Studios and published by Electronic Arts, the 2012 reboot of Syndicate breached the PlayStation 3 in February 2012. The game is a controversial genre shift from the 1993 isometric tactical strategy original, reimagining the dormant IP as a cyberpunk first-person shooter. Set in a grim, dystopian 2069, players embody Miles Kilo, an elite cybernetically enhanced agent working for Eurocorp, one of the monolithic megacorporations warring for total control of the global marketplace. The gameplay centers heavily around the DART-6 neural chip implanted in Kilo's brain, which grants players DART vision to slow down time and see through solid walls, alongside the ability to digitally breach the minds of enemies, forcing them to drop their weapons or turn on themselves or their own allies. The game also features a robust, separate 4-player cooperative mode, allowing squads to tackle missions directly inspired by levels from the 1993 original. The corporate machinations behind the game's creation darkly mirror the dystopian themes of its own narrative. The Megacorp studio killer, Electronic Arts, originally approached Starbreeze in 2007. They were mightily impressed by the studio's work on the Chronicles of Riddick and The Darkness, thus hoping they could inject a more brutal and modern sense of style into the classic Syndicate franchise. However, development was far from smooth. After an entire year of dedicated production, the game was essentially sent completely back to the drawing board to implement the cooperative multiplayer mode seemingly demanded by market trends. Unsurprisingly, the executive decision to transform a methodical and cerebral tactics game into yet another first-person shooter drew ire from those purists who viewed it as a corporate cash grab engineered by the industry's most self-illustrating Syndicate. Nevertheless, the actual execution of the game's gunplay, as well as its stark and blindingly bloomy aesthetic interpretation of a corporatized future, captured some of the essence of the source material, even if it entirely alienated the original strategy-focused audience. Developed by Day One Studios and published by LucasArts, Fracture broke ground on the PlayStation 3 in North America on October 7, 2008. The game is a sci-fi third-person shooter set in the year 2161, taking place in a xenophobic, environmentally devastated United States, that has literally split in half due to catastrophic flooding caused by unchecked global warming. The narrative pits the cybernetically advanced Atlantic Alliance against the genetically enhanced Pacifican forces, with players assuming control of Atlantic Sergeant Jet Brody as he hunts the rogue Commander Sheridan. The entire mechanical identity of the game is built on a proprietary engine designed for real-time terrain deformation. Utilizing specialized futuristic tools like the entrencher and tectonic grenades, players can dynamically raise or lower the Earth to instantly create cover, summon ramps to reach inaccessible areas, sink enemies into deep craters, or crush them against ceilings. These physics systems effectively turn the ground itself into a real-time puzzle, forcing players to completely rethink their standard shooter strategies. At the time of its release, Fracture represented a highly publicized gamble for its publisher that ultimately failed to resonate with the wider market. In the mid-2000s, LucasArts was actively attempting to pivot away from merely publishing licensed Star Wars titles, striving to establish themselves as a powerhouse of serious, high-budget, original AAA intellectual properties. Fracture was heavily marketed alongside Star Wars The Force Unleashed as part of their grand, next-gen renaissance intended to showcase both their new direction and the processing power of the new consoles. However, despite the genuinely impressive nature of the engine's deformable terrain technology, the game was ultimately undone by a lack of artistic inspiration and generic world building. The protagonist, Jet Brody, was widely criticized by press and players alike as the absolute epitome of the generic bald Space Marine archetype that saturated 7th-gen consoles. And the core gunplay felt super repetitive once the initial novelty of the terrain manipulation wore off. Ultimately, the game failed to gain the necessary commercial traction and was rapidly forgotten. That said, there are some fascinating stories surrounding the development and creative's professional trajectory, so stay tuned for the retrospective. Developed by Spark Unlimited and published by Codemasters, Turning Point: Fall of Liberty plummeted onto the PlayStation 3 on February 26, 2008. The game operates as a first-person shooter set against an alternate history backdrop where British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was killed by a taxi in 1931, leading directly to the collapse of Great Britain and the victory of the Axis powers in World War II. The narrative abruptly leaps forward to 1953, where an isolationist America is suddenly subjected to a massive, technologically advanced Nazi invasion on the East Coast. The player is Dan Carson, a supposedly ordinary New York construction worker pulled into the role of an insurgency fighter against an overwhelming occupying force. To mechanically emphasize Carson's lack of military training, the gameplay features environmental traversal mechanics, like climbing across these high-altitude girders, that showcase his blue-collar occupational skills, while limiting his combat proficiency to desperate-feeling melee grapples and scavenging enemy weaponry. The execution of this narrative premise stands as one of the greatest missed opportunities of the 7th console generation. The studio, Spark Unlimited, was founded by a team of 28 veteran developers who had previously worked on the critically acclaimed Medal of Honor series, theoretically giving them unparalleled world-class pedigree in the World War II shooter genre. However, the actual implementation of the game's mechanics was incredibly poor, plagued by a seriously troubled development cycle on Unreal Engine 3 that resulted in archaic and linear level design, laughable enemy AI, and boring gunplay. The incredibly rich lore and alternate history world building were bizarrely absent from the game's actual narrative presentation. Instead, the vast majority of the complex plot and geopolitical context was conveyed entirely through external media like physical game manuals, a GameStop gamble I clearly lost, and fictionalized International Journal newspapers posted on the publisher's promotional website, which is, of course, gone. Consequently, a concept that could have been a cinematic, thought-provoking masterpiece was reduced to a critically panned gallery shooter that failed to leverage its own potential. That said, the game has a truly phenomenal orchestral score composed by the legendary Michael Giacchino. It was a masterpiece that was recorded in a single day. This alone is worthy of a retrospective. And that's the next 10. We now have our roadmap for the next leg of our expedition. And if you enjoyed this little preview of what's coming next, please like, subscribe, and hit the little bell thingy. Thanks so much for watching. Catch you on the flip side.